Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. This is the first in a series of 7 podcasts with our friends at REPL, covering all things workforce management. Today we're going to be talking about labour standards, and delighted to be joined by Doug, Pip and Zach from REPL. Hi guys, how you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Hi Simon. Thanks for having us on.
No, you're welcome. Hi Doug, hi Zach.
Hi Simon. How's it going? Thanks for having us.
Good. No, you're welcome. So we'll just find out a little bit about each of you before we get into the detail. Doug, let's start with you. Do you want to tell us what you do in REPL and where you do it?
Sure. So I'm the WFM capability lead based out of Cape Town, South Africa. So I've been with REPL for about 6 years now. Worked across a number of different WFM implementations over the years, and have a particular interest in the kind of labour standards and labour modelling space.
Perfect. Good to have you on, Doug. Zach, we'll move to you. I think we're going to get a different accent. I should have said at the start, this is continental. So we've got South Africa, America and Europe, UK represented. Hi, Zach.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a senior consultant on our US team. Right now, I'm filling the role of a solutions architect on one of our projects here in the US with a lot of time focused around building out clients' labor models.
Awesome. And finally, and not least, Pip.
Hi, I'm Pip. I've been with REPL for over 11 years now. I'm based in the UK and I work as a solution architect, so rolling out WFM for lots of different clients. Quite a lot of those. It has been for the labour model side of things. I've had quite a lot to do with that.
We're going to talk today about labour standards. We'll, I'm sure, touch on labour modelling as well. And for those that haven't listened to previous episodes where we've talked about capturing labour standards and work study, work measurement, whatever terminology you want to use. To keep it simple, labour standards, you might also hear them called task times, activity times, standard minute values. They have a whole bunch of different names depending on who you speak to, are essentially the measured times for an activity. So an industrial engineer, a study analyst, or if you use a methodology which is called predetermined, where you pick off a historic database, will visualize that project. They'll record the times of a number of observations, which will build a nice credible average of, let's use an example, the time for a till transaction. And within that, there'll be a bunch of detail, which is normally called an element, which will, again, add up to the time of the total till transaction, but we'll break it down into the component parts. So if you think of when you go into a typical store, you'll want to pay, you'll probably have a chat at the start, say hi, they'll scan your goods, they'll ask you maybe if you've got a loyalty card, you can pay by card, cash, check if you're of a certain age, Apple Pay if you're probably of a certain age, younger generation. They might bag you things, you might have a chat and say goodbye. So it's broken down into those visible, tangible steps of a process. Now, I think one of the things that is a darker or maybe confusing for people that don't know it intrinsically, like the guys we've got on the podcast today, is around what level of labour standards should you have. So I think we'll start with you, Pip, on this one and get your thoughts. We can class them as low-level labour standards, so probably in that detailed level that I've just talked about, or high level. How do you help your clients think about what level they should use? Not necessarily what level they've captured, because you can use the capture stuff to drive process improvement and other things, but from a labour standards, labour modelling point of view, what things and how do you go about helping them think about the things that make it practical to use?
As you alluded to, Simon, it's difficult because there's no right or wrong answer with this, and I think it's something very much that we have to sit down with. Will be different for different clients depending on how they want to use them. So one of the, I guess, some of the key questions I would be looking at is, what benefit is it going to do to bring in a really low level of granularity? So I think you gave an example, but another example might be, do you bring in an SMV value for scanning a tin of baked beans, or scanning every brand of baked beans, for example? depending on the level that you decide to bring in, how does that actually, what does that then translate to in terms of then the difference in hours that you get as the output? Because if you're talking 0.000 of a second, then actually, is there any benefit in bringing that in with then all the effort that goes in maintaining it, etc.? So I think I would say, how does it impact your end result? How practical is it for the client to do it, to manage it, and then to maintain it? And then also, have they got all of the data, for example, that would be needed to then drive that data? So it's kind of all of those questions that we would look at. And I think it's probably fair to say that with quite a few clients, you might decide at a certain level, and then as you go through the process of the end-to-end process of understanding what that hour's output looks like, you might then go back and rethink some of your original decisions. And I think probably, if I was asked kind of, I guess, an overview on what my opinion was based on the number of projects I've been on, I would say that generally I have tended to see clients move from having quite a granular level to then moving it up to a higher level. And that's kind of a recommendation that I would generally go with, unless you're going to get benefit from it and it drives a really important detail, then I would kind of stay at that slightly higher level than necessarily going to the granular.
Yeah, I agree. And I think because clearly we capture the labour standards data, and the teams go out with the apps to capture it, and then it gets fed into projects we work on together and elsewhere. I'm always of the opinion, absolutely, use the data at the highest level, because you can always roll data up. So you can capture it at a much lower level than maybe you'll use, but it's far easier to roll data up than it is to try and go down if you've not captured it and make assumptions on trying to split it into different ways. So yeah, I agree. From a labour modelling, use it at the highest level, simplicity, ease of maintenance. But from a capture point of view, there might be a level down, which gives you the comfort of you can always go down if you need to. But yeah, far easier to wrap data up than move down. Doug, do you see any differences in your part of the world, or is it much the same?
No, I would just echo the kind of same sentiments. I think the tendency is always, when you've gone to the effort of measuring those standards, you got your engineers that get involved, and they kind of get a little carried away sometimes, where you measure it right down to the lowest level. And I would say it's really about the law of diminishing returns. Like it's what value are you going to get by configuring that level of labor standard within the labor model. There's things like smoothing. There's the data that needs to drive that low level of activity that need to be taken into consideration as well. So yeah, I would say always kind of, as you say, measure it at the lowest available level, but then be really pragmatic and practical in terms of how you configure that within the solution.
Yeah. And Zach, does that resonate with your clients in America?
Yeah, definitely. I think the big thing that Pip and Doug touched on is it practical? So I think for a lot of our customers, at the end of the day, we're scheduling to this demand. So how practical is the workload that we're putting together throughout a day, and how well is the store or the manager themselves then going to be able to schedule to that to ensure that all that labor is being covered while all other parameters that we have to meet are being met. We
can safely say that the more data you capture, you don't necessarily need to use it at the granular level you may capture your standard minute values. There's a benefit in using them at a higher level to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success in the future. So once we've got our labour standards, standard minute values, again, whatever terminology you feel free to use, typically then they'll be fed into some sort of labour model. Now, they can be Excel-based, there's solution bases. All of the WFM vendors have a type of labour model they offer within their solution. So I don't think it's probably worth touching on where's the right place to build your labour model, because I think there's an individual answer for each organisation, and it suits them in terms of however they want to and where they want to build it. But in general terms, when you guys start to build or configure labour models, are there 3 or 4 kind of key things that you look out for when you've got a blank sheet of paper when you start? You've got your times. Clearly, they need to hook into some business data, be it delivered items, transactions, whatever that might be. But from a configuration build point of view, and maybe we start with you, Doug, and see how it goes in your part of the world. What kind of things do you start to think about with your clients as first principles?
Yeah, so I think I would try to look at it from the end user perspective. So the reason that we're building labor models is to output labor for scheduling managers or store managers to be able to schedule again. So it's really thinking about how they need to schedule in their store and what information is going to be pertinent to that process. And then starting to kind of think about the labor model in that context. So there's no point kind of going back to our previous discussion, going down to a really low level, losing a lot of the labor to smoothing, and then outputting a result that doesn't really mean a lot to the end user in terms of from a scheduling perspective. So I think really understanding the different areas within the store, how they schedule today, and trying to build a labor model that suits that current process. That would be where I would kind of at least start.
And Zach, do you have any different builds on that, or is it, again, relatively similar?
I think it's relatively similar. I think that Doug touched on a little bit, but I know in my experiences are a lot. I haven't had nearly as much as Doug and Pip, but it's been, how can we best recreate what's actually happening? So obviously, like the labor standards are all built out and the timings, but then when you're scheduling or you're creating the labor model, how can we best recreate what's happening and keeping it simple? So whether it's, I think Doug touched on, minimum manning in certain situations, things like that, but just keeping it simple for them to recreate what's actually happening in their store.
As a user, I like the fact you're starting with the end in mind. So you're starting with the users of the system or the people that are working those processes and trying to replicate what currently happens. And I think that's really important because labor models are science, measurement, and art in terms of the interpretation. Pip, maybe this is one for you. I always see the best outputs and the most credible labor models with the most buy-in when it's real, not some computer-based or spreadsheet-based scientific classroom exercise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think certainly, particularly when we're, the labour model is maybe new into a client, and maybe we're also introducing WFM scheduling as a new concept, that buy-in to the labour model and how it's been put together, and the fact that making it practical is crucial, not just to the success of the labour model, but it's also the success of the WFM project as well. So it is the most, almost in some ways, the most important thing, because if people don't trust what that output is, that labour demand curve is, then ultimately the whole kind of all of the pieces then don't work, and you get yourself in quite a difficult situation. And actually what we've seen is if you kind of miss the boat on getting it right at the beginning, it's very difficult to then buy back that trust and confidence in it then going forwards.
Yeah, and it's worth saying at this point we'll cover demand curves and minimum manning and rounding in future pods around more of the scheduling aspect, but the key output from the labour model is the hours by store, task, role, depending on the configuration, by day, even 15 minutes, that then feeds into the rest of the parts of the workforce management solution, that you then can see the shape of that work, see when it should happen, and then in a future state start to plan people against it. A bit like the labour standards then, what I'm hearing is maybe we can start simply. Labour models can evolve over time and can get more complex as the organisation gets more mature with the workforce management solution and the ways of working. In terms of things like global organisations or trying to standardise things across groups of stores or companies within companies, again, we'll start with you, Pip. What watch-outs have you seen, or things that work well when it's a multi-brand or a multi-country organisation?
My experience of this is that pretty much 80%, maybe even 90% of a labour model can largely be standardised. I think what I tend to see is that however simple the business and however closely aligned you think it might be in the labour model, there always tends to be some differences between countries. So generally, the challenge is, particularly then thinking about how you name it, how you maintain it, but it's kind of making sure you keep that standardization as much as you can, because also that allows for, all the reporting and pieces like that. And then just kind of tagging on, I guess, those extra parts of the business that are specific for that individual country.
And I think it's fair to say in some of those where you've got organisations that are global and they've got certain countries that only have 2 or 3 of a certain configuration of store or type of store or type of offer within a store, you're not going to measure everything. So you'll have, in certain labour models I've seen, you'll have allowances, you'll have characteristics that you can turn on and off at site level, which trigger different types of timing or types of allowances. That the kind of stuff you're used to, Zach? Those, the 80-20 rule, you can't measure everything, but there's ways within the model where you can allow for some of those anomalies.
Yeah, definitely. Projects I've been a part of, that's exactly what it's been. It's, for majority of our stores, this is what they're going to follow. This is what we built out as far as labor model goes. And then that other 20% is either identified and addressed, through configuration or other avenues, or there's a level of understanding that that's where the difference lies. But as long as, depending on what KPIs they use, if you're falling within those certain measurements, they've either overlooked or they understand that 20% difference lies there. But for the most part, there is a standard across all of their stores, or even I've seen it in different types of stores, like within one client, they've got different brands, and it's standard even across them, with the understanding that this is where, this store type difference from the base, if you will.
Doug, have you got any builds on that?
Yeah, I think it actually ties quite nicely to what we kicked off the podcast with in terms of the level. So the lower down you go in terms of measuring your standards and using those within the labor model, the further away you get from being able to really standardize it. As soon as you start to roll up those activities into more generic activities, the more you're able to standardize it. And I feel the more value you're able to get. And I think you've got to kind of remember that a lot of these companies are going from a top-down budgeting approach to a kind of introducing them to a kind of bottom-up labor model where you have an activity-based labor model, and to keep that as simple as possible, both from a operational point of view and also standardization if you're a big global business, is really key.
No, they're good points. And again, for those that aren't familiar with the terminology, so top-down would be where an organisation typically uses something like a sales to salary percentage to work out the cost that you get. So it's typically all in pounds. When we talk about bottom-up, it really is this conversation we've just been having around using labour standards, using business rules and metrics to, from the bottom up, understand how much labour hours is required, and then where applicable apply a cost to that to create the budget cost. So it does turn it on its head, and for those businesses that have been through that journey, it's a big change moving from top down to bottom up, because the proportion of hours may change, because you do start to understand all those nuances, offers, locations, layouts, types of stores, things within stores that make a big difference to labour. So proportionally, you may spend the same money, but in a very different way across your store estate or even across your companies within that organisation. If we move on to, I think you call them modifiers, Pip, do you want to give us a little bit of insight into what they are?
We do the labour models, we have all of our SMV values, and then we think about when they come into the WFM system, maybe some rounding and smoothing and minimum manning that we might apply that then kind of change that hours output to if it was just in its raw form, if you like, from the labour model. So one of the other levers we can play with is, I've referred to them as modifiers here. But so, for example, we might put the information that came from the labour model into the WFM system, but we then might want to add maybe a congestion percentage, for example, or a contingency percentage or productivity percentage or something like that onto the output to say, whatever this output is, multiply it by 0.2%. And we want to essentially, it allows us to either increase or decrease the hours output. I guess it's a really easy way to control that hours output rather than having to go into each individual labour standard, try and work out, how much you'd have to reduce it by to get the output that you want. I think with modifiers, you always have to be a little bit careful. So, for example, I know of examples where people have put in labour models, they've wanted to get a certain output at the end of it in terms of hours, and they'll then dial that percentage up or down. And I think, when you're doing that to a small amount, that's absolutely fine. I think the only warning that I always give to clients is, again, back to that sort of buy-in to the labour model and to the hours output. You need to be careful with that, and you need to be able to explain it so that people don't lose faith in it. If you're trying to hit a budget, let's say, you probably want to be transparent about that than pretending it's maybe the labour model standards that have got you to that final output. But essentially, modifiers allow us to be able to control that hours output and are used by, I think, quite a lot of clients in varying ways.
Yeah, and I think everybody I know uses modifiers, stretch targets, performance factors, PF, whatever guise again you want to call it. And I think, like you, there's some watch outs in there of, for me, never change the time, the standard. It is what it is, as long as it's been measured correctly and it picks up the process, that time is what it is. So almost measuring it and then going changing that time seems a fruitless exercise. I always think they're performance factors, or let's call them modifiers then. Modifiers, they're a really nice way of transitioning from top down to bottom up, because you can have a glide path in, because if some sites are losing hours and some are gaining hours because of the redistribution, it's a nice way of gliding people in. I also think it's vital that the workload and cost match, and I think that's back to your point, Pip, of credibility. Regardless of if you're using modifiers or not, the hours that you deploy into the workforce management system have to have the cost that match it. Otherwise, you get this massive out of sync of, well, you've given me 1,000 hours, but you've only given me cost for 900. Therefore, it doesn't make sense. If you're going to give 900 hours, give the cost for 900 hours. If you're going to give 800 hours, give the cost for 800 hours. As long as they're in sync, I think people get it. It's when they get out of sync, people don't. Modifiers, some people will strive not to have them. For me, I think for organisations, it's always interesting and you use, I think, the 2% example, Pip, if you're at 5%, 10%, I think that's a really big wake-up call for the senior leadership to understand, for every 100 hours, you should give the stores or the call centres or the hotels, wherever it might be. Actually, you're only going to give them 90% or 95% of that. And the cure to that is then to look at the processes and to look at what processes you can stop, you can digitise, you can make more efficient. Because people will always want to change the dial on the modifiers and drive people to work quicker, drive out. And there comes a point, and I'll come back to you on this one, Pip, I don't know if you agree, if you keep playing with the modifiers too much, you almost invalidate all the work you've done in the labour model.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the other watch out is you get a little bit lost with what the truth is, if you like. And so, yeah, I think, as you say, they're definitely a really helpful tool. And I think they're generally necessary at some level, but they're definitely ones to be used with caution. And I think, I think we'll talk about it in a little bit kind of, doing kind of what if analysis and kind of looking at big data. But I think that's where particularly the kind of what if analysis tools are really helpful, because you can get a feel of, okay, here's my true labour model. And now I dial it by this. 5%, I dial it by 2%. What are kind of the differences in the output? And it kind of allows you to stay true to what the true labour model is, so that then you can ask yourself big questions, as you said, Simon, that if you're changing it by 10%, I mean, there's something's not quite right, and there's actually kind of probably a bigger process or problem that you need to face into.
The watch out for people. Modifiers, and I'm sure in the past 6 to 9 months, have been used in labour models for various different things, because we've almost not known what the forecast is, what the demand is, how long things take, because the operations have changed. For me, the more you use modifiers, which that portrays itself in real life, is people will spend less time serving people, and the standards in that store will be lower, because they're normally, and training will go, they're normally the 3 things that give, because people will still need to be on the tills, there'll still be stock coming in that goes on the shelf, and all the other admin work that goes. So you start to pull back on service standards and training. They're typically the 3 things that you see as a consequence of high modifiers in models. We'll wrap up by looking at the future, and I think you've touched on 2 great ones there, Pip, in terms of crunching big data and what-if analysis. Doug, do you want to talk to us a bit more about what-if analysis and what people do with it? What examples have you got where people are looking at things in the future and using that kind of way of working?
Sure, yeah. So I guess with the advent of big data, we've got so much information available now. Some of the legacy kind of systems that do a lot of this sort of stuff haven't previously been able to kind of process that amount of data quickly enough to be able to kind of really feed into that what-if analysis conversation. But now with machine learning and kind of artificial intelligence, there's a lot more processing power out there. So you're able to ask questions and to kind of really quickly say, well, what if I change this labor role to include these tasks? What would be the kind of output? And what would that mean from a hiring perspective? And what would that mean from a bottom line or from a cost perspective? So you can ask those questions, because, I mean, if you think about the model that you built from a labor model perspective, it's got all of the detail in it. Being able to quickly reposition those puzzle pieces and ask different questions of that data set is really powerful both from a planning perspective and then also from a resourcing or hiring perspective further down the line.
And Zach, in the current climate where things across the world are all a bit uncertain, that must really help as businesses go through various iterations of trying to figure out what the future might look like from a trade point of view, from a deployment of people point of view, from just a total number of heads in a store that they need point of view.
Yeah, definitely. I think it allows you to prepare for multiple situations and have a couple different plan of actions. At least for us, we saw a little bit at the beginning of this year. There's a lot of scrambling to make decisions to try to figure out, what needs to happen, like in the short term. So I think having all this information and then being able to look down the road at multiple different situations allows businesses to have decisions ready or have options based on what situations end up presenting themselves.
Can answer some of those questions that certainly the senior leaders in organisations ask at times around, what happens in scenario A, B, C and D. So if one of those does play out, they know what the cost of that is from a savings point of view or an investment point of view. So yeah, it's good to hear that that's there now. It's a lot quicker to access and crunch. And final thoughts from you, Pip, on the future? Anything else to add to those bits?
Just, I guess, reiterating that, that's definitely what I've seen in the last couple of years. The focus much, there has been a move and an expectation, really, that, systems will be able to manage that kind of the crunching of the big data, to run that across estates, to run it across also globally as well, to really understand, what those labour model changes would look like, be it for saving efficiencies, be it for short-term measures to deal with things like COVID, and I think it's really powerful.
Great to chat. I think this has set us up really well for the second one in the series, which is going to look at forecasting, and then we'll get into a bit of scheduling, and then in future series we'll look at time and attendance reporting, analytics, and then some wider debates around what the future of the whole workforce management piece looks like. So really appreciate your insights and thoughts. Thanks for joining us, and look after yourselves.
Cheers. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you very much. Cheers.